I'm making this film for people who think that getting to zero emissions by 2050 is important and something we must deliver on. I do. In the UK, we have a law which says that we are committed to having zero emissions in 2050. That's great, and we were pioneering as one of the first countries to do that. We aren't alone. The Scandinavian countries have the same target, but with an earlier date. And in the last 3 months, with the announcement from the Premier of China and with the election of Joe Biden, it looks like America and China are both going to be on a similar trajectory with a similar target date. And absolutely right, that's what's required to deliver a safe climate. The question is, how are we going to get there? Firstly, discussion in policy in the UK is using the phrase net zero to talk about this target. That implies that there are some negatives available to us, but in reality, there aren't. The most talked about one is forestry, but if you think about it, a forest is part of the natural carbon cycle. Growing trees take carbon out of the atmosphere. Cut down trees, whether they're burnt or rotting or at the end of their life as products, release the carbon back into the atmosphere. So the only way that you make a negative out of forestry is if you convert land that used to be something else into being forestry. Then you get a one-off gain. But to give you a sense of scale, if we doubled the area of forestry in the UK, that would give us a benefit of only 2 years of current emissions, and then there would be no further net benefit. There are technologies around like vacuum cleaners, which you power in order to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. But unfortunately, it's always going to take more energy to do that than we gained when we burnt fossil fuels to put the carbon in the atmosphere. That's unavoidable. It's the second law of thermodynamics. So if we have spare renewable power to power that kind of process, it would be much better to use it to replace other uses of fossil fuels. There is the possibility of so-called bioenergy carbon capture and storage, burning bioenergy, capturing the carbon released and storing it underground. But so far, the only people doing that at Drax in the UK are doing capture and release on a pilot study scale. They have a plan to expand that, though somebody else is responsible for the storage part of it, and it will be the first in the world. I really hope it works, but it's only going to be a small contribution compared to the total emissions that we have to deal with in the UK, and it will take a long time to scale elsewhere in the world. There are other things. We could expose crushed concrete to the air, and that does absorb some of the carbon that was released when the cement was made, but not all of it, and it's pretty slow. And listening to people talking about it, it sounds as if there are magic beans fertilized by unicorn's blood that are going to take this problem away from us all with other technologies. There may be, but they're not going to be ready at full scale in the time that we want them to be there. Let's put this in context by looking at what's happened in the world to date. So the left-hand graph here shows the world's emissions in blue, and the world's total energy supply in blue, and you can see at the bottom the contribution of non-emitting electricity from nuclear in red or from wind and solar in yellow. It's small compared to the total. The human use of biomass, however, is growing year on year at an alarming rate, and many ecologists are now concerned that this is going to lead to the inevitable loss of many species due to our extraordinary use of biomass just for one species. And on the right-hand graph, you can see the contribution of carbon capture and storage so far. Even though it's promoted by the hugely well-funded oil and gas industry, the total capacity for carbon capture and storage, and that's more than what's actually captured, still is so small that it hasn't left the axis of the graph. So looking at these shows you a sense of the problem with timing. And if we depend on new technologies, then it's very, very unlikely that they're going to be ready. We don't need to do them once. We need to replace everything in the world with these technologies in order to make them sufficiently, to have enough scale to deal with climate change. In the UK, the story looks a little bit better. And you can see here that the emissions we report to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have dropped 43% since 1990. And the chart shows the reasons for it. Mainly, this is due to Mrs. Thatcher's fight with the coal miners and the conversion from coal to gas-powered electricity. Sadly, some of it is also due to Mrs. Thatcher's failure to support industrial sectors in the UK and the closure of heavy industry has led to half of the apparent reduction in UK emissions. And maybe the thing I'd really pick out as the best here is our methane capture. The way that we're processing bio-waste in municipal waste sites is really good, and we've nearly got rid of all of our methane emissions from waste in the UK. But underlying it, the emissions from transport, from buildings and from agriculture are pretty much unchanged since 1990. Some of that progress, of course, is a little bit of an illusion. The United Nations Convention requires that we report emissions from the land of the UK, and we don't take account of what's happened elsewhere. So if you see this extra chart on the balance of trade in goods, clearly what's happened since 1990 is that we're importing a vast amount of products that we used to make in the UK. Now, we claim that we're not responsible for those emissions under the current form of the law, but because China is a net exporter of products, it's obvious that that negotiation is going to change. Soon we'll be required to report both our territorial or production emissions and also the emissions created by our consumption, by what we purchase. That will make us look as if we've achieved less than we have. The current agreement is also that we don't report international aviation or shipping. Obviously, that's going to change, and it's a big component of the UK. About 12.5% of our total global warming impact is due to flight at the moment. It's a serious problem, and it's not getting the public attention that it needs. And the other thing that I've shown on here is the good things that we've done by converting coal to gas, and at the top, the actions that we've taken motivated by climate change, particularly capturing methane and building offshore wind turbines to prevent us building as many gas-powered electricity plants as we would otherwise use. So we've made progress, but some of it is really an accounting progress rather than a real one in terms of our work on emissions. But if you look at this figure, you can see that new technologies have played no part. All of this is something that we've achieved using technologies that are mature and that we can scale. That's obvious because we need to take things that we can replace everything we're doing. It's not a matter of a Manhattan project or an Apollo project where we're trying to do something for the first time and that's the end of the story. In my research group, we've spent a lot of time looking at this and gathering data on fast transitions in big energy infrastructure technologies. And the 4 fastest ones are shown here: nuclear power in France, wind in Denmark, combined cycle gas turbines in the UK, and so on. And you can see there's a long period of development when the technology goes from lab scale up to reaching something like 5% of its eventual market scale. After that point, they grow at a linear, not an exponential rate, and that's because these are big, complex projects. They take a long time to deliver. But there's a long delay before they even get started. So it's great that at Drax we're trying to build the world's first bioenergy CCS plant, but to get from the first one to its scaling to having a significant global impact is a long journey. The bottom half of the graph makes an interesting contrast by showing some of the social transitions that we've made, where we've made changes due to behaviour. And you can see that looking at, for example, how we dealt with ozone, motivated by the ozone hole over the southern pole, how we converted out of lead petrol, and how we've responded to asbestos and smoking, are much faster transitions with a shorter lead time. So in the UK, so far, we've talked about technologies as being the solution, and we've not talked about social transitions. But the evidence is that the social transitions are faster, and that's what we need. At the moment, mitigating climate change is fundamentally a problem of timing rather than cost or innovation. We've got to do it quickly in order to make the planet safe and to meet our own legal commitments. So out of that, it seems to us that the way that we've got to do this is a period of restraint. We've got to use less energy and expect to restrain some of our activities for a period in order to get to zero emissions by 2050, knowing that new technologies will arrive after then to allow us to restart some of the activities that we've temporarily had to stop. Because zero emissions is so important, that restraint is one that we have to embrace, and it's something that we all are going to be involved in. To try and illustrate it, then, in the UK Fires Research Programme, which I lead, we spent time putting together the report Absolute Zero, describing what zero emissions looks like in the UK with today's technologies, but delivered securely by 2050, within 29 years of now. Here's the history of electricity generation in the UK since about 1995. And you can see that we've done something pretty good here. We've expanded our non-emitting supply, particularly offshore wind, and doing that has allowed us to reduce our emitting supply, in particular coal. So we've virtually phased out coal-powered generation in the UK. And that's the key contribution that I showed earlier on about the way that we've reduced our reported emissions. So looking at that graph, we said, okay, those two look like straight lines, the growth in the non-emitting electricity, the decline in emitting electricity. Let's project that forwards and assume we keep expanding that non-emitting electricity for the next 30 years. How much will we have? And here's the outcome. We've got to about 50% more electricity than we have today, but all of it is non-emitting, and everything else has been shut. We can't burn gas or oil or coal for any reason in the UK by the law, which says we'll have zero emissions. To understand what that means for our lives, we need first to work out what would happen if we electrified everything we do today. If we electrify all of our cars, all of our boilers, all of our cookers, and all of our industrial processes. So we worked that out, and you can see here that the height of the total chart is the amount of electricity we'd like for today's level of service, and we'll have about 60% of it. So that's great news, actually, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But there are 4 things that we can't electrify, or even if we did electrify, they would lead to emissions anyway. So those are the things we're going to have to restrain. I'll come on to those. Firstly, what does it mean to live with 60% of the amount of energy that we use today? Well, we looked at all of the technologies that use energy at the moment and their electrical equivalents, and we found there are 2 ways that we can do this. One is simply to turn them on for only 60% of the time we do today. So for people who are heating rooms in their houses where there currently isn't anybody sitting down, they could use less heat. We know that we can insulate buildings better so that the total amount of heat needed to stay comfortable in winter is less because the building would retain it better. Those are ready to roll out, and the services and businesses required to deliver it are here in the UK and are going to grow a great deal in the next decade. We also know that our cars are currently very heavy. They weigh 12 times more than the passengers inside them, and most of the seats are empty. So we could live very well with 60% of the number of car journeys just by sharing the ride or using slightly smaller cars to get there. So in each case, we found that we could either change our behaviour, or there are some existing technologies that we could roll out at scale in order to use 60% of the energy and still get all of the services we need. However, there are those 4 things that we can't continue to do. 2 of them continue to release emissions however we power them, and those are ruminants, sheep and cows, which cause methane emissions as they digest grass and their other foodstuffs, and we can't stop them doing that. So we have to cut out beef, lamb, and dairy products from our diet over the next 30 years. Cement making also releases emissions however you do it, and we currently have no alternatives operating at any meaningful scale. And that's really challenging. It means that in the next 30 years we have to live with no cement. And there's a lot of work to do to work out how we make foundations, floor slabs, and tall buildings without using any cement. We're on that, as are many other people, thinking about what the solutions might be. The 2 other problems are the ones where we can electrify them, but we aren't going to have anything like enough electricity to make it work. And those are ships and aeroplanes. There are a small number of ships in the Norwegian fjords powered by electricity, but nobody has them going long range because we don't have big enough batteries. And there will be electric aeroplanes powered by batteries, but they're going to be small and they're going to cover short distances. Nobody in the world is currently developing a battery-powered long-haul aeroplane. And although the aviation industry is making a lot of noise talking about alternative fuels, biokerosene made from plants is a problem because you saw already how much of the world's biomass we're using, and it requires an enormous input of biomass to generate the amount of fuel we need for airplanes. We can't afford to do that. And we can make kerosene by using electricity, as we can make hydrogen by using electricity, but it's really inefficient. we would have to take away from all of our other uses of electricity, give up home heating, give up cars, in order to have enough electricity to be able to power the processes to make synthetic aviation fuel. And I can't believe that we're going to want to do that. So we have to restrain 4 things and then use 60% of the amount of energy we're used to. While we're doing that, almost everything that we really enjoy can continue and grow. Having meals with friends, being compassionate, being kind, being creative, spending time in leisure, sports, spending time with our friends, the things that we all most value and most enjoy, the things that people talk about in their last year of life as the things that they most value about their lives and what they want to pass on to the next generation. All of these things can grow and expand in a real zero emissions world. The restraints are specific, but we have to face up to them rather than pretending that magic beans fertilized by unicorn's blood are going to take them away in the next 29 years. There just isn't time for that to happen. We wrote the Absolute Zero report at the end of 2019, and it's had a lot of discussion. And thinking about the way people have responded to it, I've kind of created a little chart here with 2 axes. On the horizontal axis is the question of who's responsible for the change. Is it incumbent institutions, or is it new, a transformation of the way that government works, the kinds of businesses that are going to be profitable? And on the other vertical axis, I've got the question of who's responsible. Is it the government fundamentally, or is it everybody? Is it a shared public agenda? So far, we've treated it as if it's a problem for the government to be solved by incumbent institutions and businesses. And so what they've done is to claim that they're going to invest in new technologies. It's virtually all they can do. Thank goodness that social campaigners, led by Greta Thunberg, have raised the question of urgency. We need that to wake us up. But where we're really trying to get to is down here. This is a health and safety problem. And once we see it as a health and safety problem like we do with asbestos, we'll regulate on it. And just as with asbestos, you would imagine the public outcry if any government suggested getting rid of regulation that we know secures our safe, healthy futures. That's where we have to get to. So really, the policy context of this discussion is that over the next 30 years, we need regulation to close everything that cannot be electrified. Then we need to expand the non-emitting electricity supply as rapidly as we can, while of course closing all other forms of electricity generation. And we need to design some equitable, fair and socially responsible way to share out an insufficient supply of electricity so that we meet our social responsibilities. Everybody can stay warm, everybody has optimism and hope, while we live with less electricity than we would otherwise want to do. Where we're at is that we've got exactly the right target, but the law doesn't put in place a delivery authority. The Climate Change Committee is an advisory body, but there is no body in the UK at the moment responsible for delivering this target. That's the most urgent policy need right now. But we know that politicians are very sensitive to public response. They read a lot about focus groups. They find out what people are thinking. And the more we can demonstrate that we collectively want action on this that's real and not just waiting for magic technologies to come out of the sky, the more they'll respond and put in the supportive policies to amplify what we've shown we want to happen. To finish with, this week, in the beginning of December 2020, the Prime Minister made an announcement that was of tremendous importance about the future of climate change in the UK and committed us to reduce our emissions from 1990 by 68% until 2030. So to leave us with only 32% of the emissions that we had in 1990, 9 years ahead of now. That is a tremendous announcement. I have to say that's the first time I've felt positive about what the current Prime Minister has done, and I'm really pleased that he's made that announcement. And now we have to deliver it. So let's use the last few minutes of this film to explore what that might mean. Taking the chart that I showed about electricity in the UK, let's simply project those 2 straight lines. Over the next 9 years, then all existing emitting electricity, the gas-powered electricity stations, are likely to close, and at the same time our supply of electricity will continue, our non-emitting electricity will continue to grow, And you can see that that adds up to us having around about the same electricity supply in 2030 as we have today, the same number of kilowatt hours, but they'll all be supplied by non-emitting sources. All of the power stations will shut, and it'll be a benchmark that we can use at the next general election. There are 45 large gas-powered electricity plants operating in the UK today. We're now obliged to have none of them operating in 2030. So at the next election, if 17 of them are shut, we know that Mr. Johnson has delivered on what he's promised. If they're still open, we know that he hasn't. And that's a very clear measure that we can use to assess his commitment to the announcement that he's made in December. I can now interpret that by going back to the graph of the UK's emissions history that I showed at the beginning of the film. So here's where we've got to with our 42% emissions compared to where we were in 1990. Sorry, a 43% cut. So we have 7% of the emissions that we had in 1990 now, and we're now committed to getting down to 32. If we do what I showed on the previous picture and we close all of our gas-powered, all of our emitting electricity generation, that will get us around about half of the way there. We'll then have the same amount of electricity that we have today, but no more. And that's challenging because many of the strategies for getting to 2050 require that we electrify things that are currently powered by other forms of fuel. And we aren't going to have any excess electricity to increase demand. So at the minimum, we need to make all of our uses of energy 26% more efficient than they are today. But as we start electrifying things like cars and industry, then we're going to need more savings elsewhere in order to release electricity for those new activities to begin. We can do that. We know the key actions to make our lives more efficient are to change our building envelopes, to make buildings, offices, houses, shops, hospitals better insulated and better sealed so that we need less heat input to stay at a comfortable temperature inside them. We've got to go like a rocket doing that from now on. We know about cars. Smaller, fuller vehicles would allow us to reduce our total amount of energy. That's what's the inefficiency in the system at the moment. And we can work on diet. We've started that already. The vegetarian and vegan movements are growing, and we have to support and amplify what they're doing. We also want to start electrifying industry. We do need an industry. Shipping is going to be difficult, nigh impossible in 2050. So we're going to be producing more of our own needs on our own island. And we've got to do that with electrical power. So we need to be starting to gain experience in all the processes of production powered solely by electricity. But again, we won't have any more electricity than we have now. So that depends on us finding ways to save electricity in other uses to make it possible. There are two things that really matter now. The first one is about mood and persuasion. We've got to show the government focus groups that we mean it, because then the politicians will follow. And the best example of that I've come across is the two mothers who in Sweden set up a campaign to get 100,000 people not to fly for a year. I don't quite know the numbers they got to, but it was enough for the word flight shame to enter the Swedish language, for domestic takeoffs to drop significantly, and for the government to respond by investing more in domestic rail. The same will happen here once we show the politicians that that's what we want to happen. Mood matters, and we've got to communicate by our actions, not by our words, that that's what we really want to happen. But the other thing which is driving all of our work in the UK Fires Consortium is that this is a tremendous business opportunity. There is great growth there for the businesses that learn to operate and sell the goods and services compatible with zero emissions in 29 years' time, but with a radical reduction in our total electricity use in 9 years' time. So we're trying to articulate where those growth opportunities are. And to give you a simple example, without any cement, we aren't going to be able to build the conventional foundations that we use when we build new houses or house extensions. So there are opportunities there for new ways of delivering that. And we're trying to stimulate those markets to get people going in delivering foundations in a new way that doesn't depend on the inevitable emissions of cement. We don't need any more talking. All we need to do now is to act. And I hope that from watching this film, it's given you some ideas about where you could start taking meaningful actions now. And of course, for more information, please take a look at the UK Fire's website. Thanks very much for watching.